So yesterday I mentioned that I have this book, the Smithsonian Book of Newspaper Comics. And I thought it would be a good idea to go through the book, maybe a page or two at a time, and talk about the drawings from an artist's perspective, or at least an amateur artist's perspective. What I failed to mention, because I didn't remember, is that I have a second book of a similar type, 100 Years of American Newspaper Comics. Now, this is an encyclopedia which lists about 400 different comics alphabetically. So we'll be ending with Ziggy and Zippy the Pinhead. But it does have a lot of illustrations. So I thought these two books actually would go well together, maybe just a page or two at a time. And this would give a good overview of the history of the comics in a way that my previous book didn't, since my previous book was more of a history and it only had tiny illustrations. I really wanted to look at some of these drawings up close and just to get a better feel of them. I mentioned before that on YouTube there are many art historians, there are many comic historians, there are many artists, and there are many comic book artists, but I don't think I've seen anyone who is a comic book artist who talks about comics history. And I think that's an interesting intersection because the artist will have a very different perspective than a historian will have. So I guess I'll just have to do it myself. So, just it's very informal, just a page or two at a time, just to give some idea of the breadth of newspaper cartoons. So anyway, here we have an early example of the Yellow Kid. The Yellow Kid is sort of honorarily considered the very first comic strip. It started in 1895 or 1896, depending on how you look at it. Now, unfortunately, the Yellow Kid is almost impossible to read, and I don't know, it might be because of the technology of the day. I mean, it was a very primitive print setting techniques. Obviously, they were printed very large, so I can't tell you exactly what's happening in terms of the dialogue, but the punchline is the Yellow Kid has a newfangled phonograph. He is interacting with it, but it's not the phonograph that's working. He was talking to a parrot the whole time. Now here, we're just going to look at comics 1 and 2. All of these are numbered sequentially for purposes of documentation. So here we have a very early Yellow Kid, opening of the Hogan's Alley Athletic Club. Now, when we see something like this, I imagine this was a full newspaper sheet. So this would have been huge originally. So it would have been much easier to read the text. As it is very difficult to make out what is written, but in some ways I'm not sure that it's entirely necessary because we get the idea. The idea is that this is a neighborhood filled with immigrants, mostly Irish immigrants and a few German immigrants and a few others. They do mention Turkish baths. And the idea is that these poor children are sort of creating their own athletic club out of the materials they have. So out of, just everyday house materials, they're sort of recreating this gym, and it looks like a circus, and that's the joke. So, you have kids playing poker, and you have children. They look like they're doing acrobats, and they think they're doing exercises. And that's the whole joke. Also, keep in mind, back then, these comics would have been read aloud. People would have passed the paper to each other, and they would have added jokes to their own. Things were very interactive back then. They weren't looking at screens and just talking to themselves. Now, in this one, this is interesting because we actually have a series of events, but rather than being laid out in panels as we would understand it, instead we follow the clockwise. We do have numbers to help us on our way, and then we have this character of this character, sort of a W.C. Fields character, about maybe a generation before him. And the idea is that the old man comes to town, and this kid wants to show him a good time because the kid wants the old man's money. And so the kid shows him all of the fun things you can do in the city, including Look how the buildings, they're as tall as mountains. They get some wet food. I'm not sure if is wet food, is that supposed to be like chop suey or maybe just warm food. It's in quotation marks, so it's got to be slang. He goes for an automobile ride. So we're talking very primitive automobiles. This is 1902, by the way. They go for a show. They pay for the French. The French, also in quotation marks, so maybe the French just means alcohol because the old guy gets drunk and he gets taken home in the wagon. And the kid thinks he's so smart because he got the old man's wallet, but the wallet had no money in it or just lottery tickets. The old man was trickier than the kid, and that's the joke. So, we see some of the elements of the comic. I mean, we can imagine this as in a more modern format and would still tell the same story. You'll notice the narration does tell a lot of the story, and I do think it's interesting that the story itself is in black and white, but the picture here does have some coloring. By the way, this picture does appear as a front piece in this book, all in black and white. So, let's see. Should be. Okay, here we go. So this must be how the plate looks, or, the reverse of the plate, if you understand me. Um, Really good cross-hatching. I mean, we can see the those techniques at the time. I mean, the earliest cartoonists were, well, I mean, they were illustrators who were illustrating something to be made into plates. So many of them were engravers. Anyway, here is an early look at comics, and tomorrow let's look at Buster Brown in all of its brilliant glory. All right, I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.